Okay, so in this class, we're going to continue our discussion of copyrightable subject matter by revisiting the concept of copyrights in facts and, more importantly, compilations of facts, which we discussed to some extent earlier in the context of Feist v. Rural. But in this class, we'll talk more specifically about sort of how we conceptualize a fact and why a fact can't be protected by copyright, whatever it is that we think a fact actually is. And in addition, we will discuss when it is that a compilation of facts can be protected by copyright, or rather, what qualities of a compilation of factual information would make that compilation protectable. In other words, how do we distinguish or differentiate protectable compilations from unprotectable compilations? So the initial question really is, what is a fact anyway, and why isn't a fact protected by copyright, or why can't a fact be protected by copyright? What quality of a fact is it that makes facts unprotectable in the first place? So historically, the Supreme Court and lower courts seem to have looked at this question primarily as one of sort of, we might call it abstraction or merger, right? The idea being that kind of factual information needs to be available to everyone to use, and therefore you can't claim ownership over the underlying factual information. You can only claim ownership over distinctive or particular ways of expressing that factual information. The Supreme Court seemed to have taken a different tack in Feist v. Rural, but hopefully, as we discussed earlier, not necessarily a very convincing one, right? So the Supreme Court has characterized the problem with copyright protection of facts as being one rooted in the requirement that an element of a work be independently created by the author of the work in order to be protectable, and says, well, facts aren't independently created, therefore facts aren't protectable. The problem is that doesn't really seem to fit all that well. I mean, for example, the very facts in question in Feist v. Rural were in fact created by Rural in every meaningful sense, insofar as the telephone listings that the Supreme Court said couldn't be protected were in fact generated by Rural and didn't exist until Rural created them. But more than that, it's also just not the case that any kind of quote unquote fact is really just copied from the world in some sort of direct way. Facts are always the product of human intervention and human society. And, you know, calling something a fact is to sort of differentiate it from the world as a whole and to think of it as an abstraction of the world as a whole. So this sort of tying it to independent creation doesn't really seem to work. And maybe we should conceptualize it more in relation to the idea expression dichotomy. And you might ask yourself, as we talk about the examples for today's class, sort of how the courts are conceptualizing the works at issue and how that conceptualization affects their assessment of whether or not those works are protectable by copyright, and if they are, what elements or aspects of those works are protectable. Okay, well, so in the Key Publications v. Chinatown Today case, this was decided almost immediately after the Supreme Court decided Feist v. Rural, and the Second Circuit had to apply the Feist v. Rural decision, and it came to a pretty interesting conclusion. So what was happening here? Well, Key Publications produced a Chinese telephone directory. Basically, they created a compilation of the businesses in New York City that were doing business that was of interest, or that they deemed to be of potential interest to Chinese or Chinese American people, and then created a kind of categorized directory, sort of like a Yellow Pages directory of all of those businesses. And Chinatown Today produced a similar but different Yellow Pages or Chinese telephone directory, trying to accomplish something very similar, using or referencing many of the same businesses, but adopting a somewhat different format. And Key Publications filed an infringement action. There was really a two-part question in the case. The first question being, could Key Publications directory be protected in the first place? And second, was the Chinatown Today directory infringing? Now, the copyrightability question was a live one because, of course, Feist had just been decided, saying that a White Pages telephone directory couldn't be infringed because it couldn't be copyright protected at all, right? So if copyright can't protect the work, then it certainly can't be infringed. There's nothing original in it to infringe in the first place. So the question was, could Key Publications directory be copyrighted at all? And there the court said, yes, this is a copyrightable work. It's not like the White Pages directory in Feist v. Rural, right? Because unlike Rural's directory, which consisted just of all of its subscribers in alphabetical order, Key Publications had in effect exercised its discretion and created a unique or original ordering and arrangement of the various businesses that it wanted to include. So it didn't just include all Chinese-speaking businesses. It made a selection of which businesses to include and which businesses not to include, and then it had a very elaborate system of categorization that it slotted all the different businesses into in order to make the book more useful to consumers. And so the court said, well, by virtue of the fact that they made those kinds of decisions about the organization, about the selection, ordering, and arrangement of the facts in the telephone directory, that makes it copyrightable. Now, it might be a thin copyright, but it's copyrightable nonetheless because the selection, ordering, arrangement of the listings is protectable under the circumstances. But then the question became, did the other directory infringe? And there the court said no. And why not? It said, well, there's a lot of crossover amongst the listings, but that's because they're listing the same kind of things. You can't own the idea of a Chinese telephone directory. You can only own a copyright in the particular Chinese telephone directory you produce. And as a point in fact, Chinatown Today's directory is quite different, organized differently. Not all the listings are the same. And the court looked at the two and compared them and said, it's just not close enough that it could be infringing. This, of course, leaves the question is, how close does it have to be? How do you know for sure when something crosses that line? And is it the kind of evaluation that Chinatown Today, or Key Publications for that matter, could have made in advance? Or do they have to wait for the court to tell them on the back end? That seems like that can't be the right answer. So we're left with a interesting and I think reasonably compelling outcome, but not a whole lot of clear rationale as to how the court got there or how to apply the same rationale to future cases. And so we see a similar but related problem in the CCC v. Maclean case. So what happened here? Maclean, much like the National Automobiles Association, produces a red book. The National Automobile Dealers Association produces the Blue Book. Both of these are guides published on a regular basis that at least purport to provide sort of predicted values in the marketplace for different models of used cars. And they're broken down in a range of different ways. They involve the expert judgment of the people who put together the Red Book and the Blue Book. And the idea is to kind of give people a baseline expected price for used cars, of course, accommodating various different features, models, and condition that would affect the value in the market of the car in question. So CCC is in the business of producing databases, and one of the databases that they produce is one intended to help consumers and others figure out appropriate pricing of used automobiles more effectively. And so one of the tools that they provide is a sort of number crunching of various different used car price guides, including the Red Book. And so Maclean brings an action against CCC for copyright infringement, saying you copied all the information in our price guide. We spent a lot of time and energy putting that together, probably doesn't matter, sort of the brow and so on. But we also exercise our discretion, right? I mean, we didn't just like copy facts from the world. We had to use our own discretion to figure out what those appropriate prices would be. And therefore, that information ought to be protected by copyright. And the Second Circuit agreed, right? It said, yeah, you had to use your judgment and figure out what you thought those prices would be. CCC is just copying the work that you created. This work satisfies the minimal requirements for copyright protection. And therefore, because this is an exact copy, they're copying all the information, or at least the vast majority of the information into their own database, that's infringing. And Maclean, you should prevail in this action. So what's the difference between this and the Chinatown Today case? Does it matter that the information was different? Why was CCC copying all the information rather than only some of the information? Would it have been as useful to consumers if they copied only some of the information? What's the underlying principle here? Not sure, and we will discuss it in class.